The first swing of the broadaxe bit deep into the 30-foot lodgepole pine on the morning of October 14th, 1886. The ambient temperature in the Gallatin Valley of Montana Territory hovered at a brittle 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the frost coating the prairie grass shattered like glass beneath heavy leather boots. 3 cowhands from the Diamond R outfit rode past the property line, pulling their horses up short to stare at the bizarre, impossible geometry rising from the frozen earth. Astrid Sorenson, a 34-year-old Norwegian widow, was not tearing down her late husband's tiny 12x 14-foot log cabin. Instead, she was painstakingly erecting a massive 40x 50-foot timber frame directly over and entirely around it. From the road, it looked as though a wooden leviathan was in the process of swallowing a matchbox. One of the cowboys leaned over his saddle horn, spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the frost, and shouted over the biting wind that she was building a monument to prairie madness. He laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that carried clearly across the empty acreage, telling her that if the wind didn't knock her giant birdcage down, the snow load surely would. Astrid did not stop her work. She did not look up. She simply drove the steel edge of the adze into the pine, peeling away another long strip of pale wood. She knew something the laughing men on horseback did not yet understand. Nature doesn't care about your pride. When the temperature drops to 40 below zero and the sky turns to white violence, physics is the only judge that matters. To understand the sheer audacity of what Astrid was attempting, one must understand the brutal arithmetic of the frontier. Niels Sorensen, her husband of 9 years, had been dead for exactly 47 days. A sudden, violent summer fever had swept through their isolated claim in late August, taking a strong, capable man from perfect health to a quiet grave on the eastern ridge in less than a week. He left Astrid with a drafty cabin, 3 draft horses, 2 dairy cows, a flock of 20 Rhode Island red chickens, and a terrifying financial ledger. Sitting by the light of a single tallow candle the night after she buried him, Astrid had emptied her late husband's leather lockbox onto the rough-hewn pine table. She possessed exactly $41.50 in silver coins. That was the entirety of her safety net. In the autumn of 1886, a single 100-pound barrel of flour cost $3.50. A cord of split, seasoned firewood, if purchased from the timbermen in Bozeman, cost $4 ounce. The mathematics of survival were agonizingly clear. During their first winter in the Gallatin Valley in 1885, Niels and Astrid had burned through 8 full cords of wood just to keep their tiny 12x14 cabin barely habitable. 8 cords of wood represents roughly 1,024 cubic feet of timber. It requires thousands upon thousands of axe swings, immense caloric expenditure, and relentless, back-breaking labor to fell, buck, split, and stack. Astrid was a strong woman, but she was a realist. Operating on a widow's caloric deficit, managing the livestock alone, and facing a Montana winter without a partner, she could not physically process 8 cords of wood before the heavy snows arrived. If she attempted to buy the wood, it would consume $32 of her remaining $41.50, leaving her to starve before the spring thaw. Furthermore, the cabin Niels had built, though constructed with love, was a thermodynamic disaster. Like most American frontier cabins, it was a standalone structure, completely exposed to the relentless, prevailing northwest winds. It was built with standard round log construction, meaning the gaps between the logs varied wildly. Niels had chinked those gaps with a mixture of prairie mud and dried moss, but as the logs cured and shrank, microscopic fissures opened throughout the building envelope. During the previous January, Astrid had watched the physics of heat loss play out with cruel efficiency. The small cast-iron stove sat in the center of the room, radiating intense heat. But warm air is buoyant. It rose immediately to the ceiling, leaked out through the unsealed eaves, and created a negative pressure vacuum at the floor level. This phenomenon, known as the stack effect, relentlessly pulled sub-zero air in through the shrinking chinking. They had burned 100 pounds of wood a day, the iron stove glowing cherry red, yet the water in the bucket, sitting just 4 feet away from the fire, had frozen solid by morning. Frost, half an inch thick, had accumulated on the inside of the window panes. They were burning a mountain of fuel merely to fight the outside air, locked in a losing thermodynamic battle against the vast, freezing atmosphere of Montana. Now, completely alone, Astrid looked at the approaching winter. The indigenous tribes and the seasoned mountain men were already predicting a brutal season. The wildlife was growing unusually thick coats, and the migratory birds had fled south weeks earlier than usual. It would soon become known to history as the Great Die-Up of 1886-1887, a winter so cataclysmic it would wipe out millions of cattle and completely reshape the American West. Astrid did not have the capital to build a better house, nor the strength to cut enough wood to heat the flawed one she had. But what she did have was the ancestral memory of her people. In the high, unforgiving fjords of Norway and across the brutal plains of northern Europe, peasant farmers had faced these exact survival mathematics for over a millennium. They did not survive by stubbornly building standalone wooden boxes and fighting the winter with massive, wasteful fires. Instead, they built the Langhus, the longhouse, or the Low German Haufenhof, the housebarn. They understood a fundamental biological truth. Every living creature is a walking, breathing furnace. A single draft horse resting in a stall generates approximately 2,500 BTUs, British thermal units, of sensible heat per hour. A dairy cow radiates roughly 2,000 BTUs per hour. Even a flock of 20 chickens generates a steady output of thermal energy. Astrid realized that her 3 horses, 2 cows, and flock of poultry were continuously radiating over 12,000 BTUs of free, life-saving heat every single hour into the frigid Montana sky. In the conventional American frontier model, the barn was built 100 yards away from the house to avoid the smell of manure, leaving the animals to heat an empty wooden shell while the humans froze in a separate box. It was a cultural luxury born of milder climates and abundant timber. Out here, it was a lethal inefficiency. Astrid decided she would not fight the winter. She would trap the heat she already owned. She would build a massive, heavily insulated barn completely surrounding her husband's cabin. The cabin would cease to be an exterior structure battling the elements. It would become the insulated central core of a giant living thermal battery. The animals would heat the barn would buffer the cabin, and the brutal Montana wind would be forced to fight through layers of dead air, thick timber, and ambient livestock radiation before it ever reached her skin. It was a brilliant application of vernacular engineering. It was also, to the conservative, proud, and deeply traditional settlers of the Gallatin Valley, utterly scandalous. If you are the kind of person who values practical wisdom over popular opinion, who understands that the old ways hold secrets modern convenience has forgotten, subscribe to help preserve these frontier techniques. Also, comment below, which city are you watching from? To execute a 40 by 50 foot house barn using only hand tools, scavenged materials, and the sheer force of a widow's desperation required a masterclass in vernacular engineering. Astrid began where all permanent survival begins. In the dirt. Before a single vertical post could be raised, she spent 10 grueling days excavating a perimeter trench. The Montana frost line, the depth to which groundwater in the soil is expected to freeze, routinely reached 48 inches. If she laid her foundation above that line, the inevitable spring frost heave would violently expand the freezing ground, buckling her barn walls and tearing the structure apart. Working from dawn until dusk, she carved 180 linear feet of trench, precisely 4 feet deep into the unforgiving clay. Into this trench, she hauled tons of smooth river stones from the nearby creek. She did not use mortar. She painstakingly dry-stacked the stones, interlocking their irregular shapes through careful geometry. This was not merely to save the cost of cement, it was a deliberate physical barrier. Dry-stacked stone creates a capillary break. preventing the subterranean moisture from wicking upward into the wooden sill plates. Rot is the silent killer of frontier timber, and Astrid was building this fortress to outlast her. Once the foundation ring was set, she began the massive framing. Having traded her late husband's heavily tooled leather saddle to a local mill for a wagon load of rough sawn pine, she engineered the barn's envelope. She did not build a single drafty wall. Instead, she constructed a double-boarded exterior, leaving a precise 4-inch dead air cavity between the inner and outer planks. Dead air is a terrible conductor of heat, making it one of the finest natural insulators on Earth. But an empty cavity can harbor pests. Over the course of a week, Astrid painstakingly filled this 4-inch void with a mixture of dry sawmill sawdust and agricultural lime. The calcium carbonate in the lime served a dual purpose. It violently deterred burrowing rodents, and it acted as a desiccant, absorbing ambient moisture to prevent the sawdust from settling into a rotting fungal mass. This 4-inch wall created a massive thermal lag, meaning the biting cold of the outside atmosphere would take hours, if not days, to penetrate the barrier. It was during the packing of these walls that Silas Vance rode onto her property. Silas was 45, the owner of the very sawmill that had cut her lumber, and a man who prided himself on modernity. He had built 20 conventional stick-frame houses in the valley, all modeled on the airy balloon frame styles popular back east. "Mrs. Sorenson," Silas called out, dismounting his horse and walking over to tap his knuckles against her double-boarded wall. "I sold you good timber, but you are turning it into a coffin. You cannot seal a building up tight like this, especially not if you intend to drag your livestock inside." Silas, like many educated men of 1886, subscribed heavily to the miasma theory of disease, the belief that illness was spontaneously generated by bad, stagnant air. "The effluvia from the beasts will poison the air," Silas lectured, his tone dripping with the condescension reserved for immigrants and grieving widows. "Horse breath and cow dung trapped inside a sealed wooden box. The moisture alone will rot this pine from the inside out within 2 years. You are building a damp, dark tomb. It isn't proper building. It isn't civilized." Astrid wiped the sweat and lime dust from her brow. "The wood will not rot, Mr. Vance, because the interior wall will never reach the dew point." Silas blinked, unfamiliar with the precise thermodynamic terminology. "If the inner wall stays warm," Astrid explained patiently, "the moisture from their breath cannot condense into liquid water upon it, and the air will not be stagnant. I am relying on convection." She pointed her adze toward the roofline. "Nature doesn't care about your miasma, Mr. Vance. It only cares about pressure and temperature." Silas scoffed, remounted his horse, and rode away, certain he would be purchasing her foreclosed property at a tax auction by spring. What Silas Vance and the other conventional builders failed to grasp was the astonishing power of biological thermal mass. Once the outer shell was enclosed, Astrid focused on the roof and the core. Her husband's original 12x14 cabin sat dead center in the new massive space, directly above the cabin's roof and spanning the sturdy 208 joists she had set on 16-inch centers. Astrid created a loft. Into this loft, she pitched 4 solid feet of cured prairie hay. Hay, when packed densely, is composed of millions of microscopic pockets of trapped air. By stacking it 4 feet deep directly over her living quarters, she created a staggering R-value, a barrier of thermal resistance so thick that absolutely zero heat from the cabin below could escape upward into the winter sky. And she would need that heat, because she was about to harness a living furnace. Physics dictates that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred. In the bitter cold of a Montana winter, a single resting draft horse generates roughly 2,500 BTUs of sensible heat every hour just by metabolizing its feed. A dairy cow outputs approximately 2,000 BTUs per hour. By designing the barn's interior so that the livestock stalls flanked her cabin on 3 sides, Astrid was capturing the ambient radiation of 3 horses, 2 cows, and 20 chickens. The mathematics were absolute. Her animals would generate over 12,000 BTUs of free, continuous heat every single hour. In a 24-hour period, that equaled 288,000 BTUs of thermal energy released directly into the enclosed envelope of the barn. She was not fighting the cold with chopped wood. She was fighting it with prairie grass, processed through the stomachs of her herd and converted into biological fire. But her grand design attracted the attention of the valley's most powerful resident. Elias Thorne, a 52-year-old cattle baron of immense wealth, arrived in a lacquered buggy a week before Halloween. Thorne had recently completed a sprawling 3-story Victorian mansion on the open prairie, a monument to his wealth featuring complex roof lines, towering ceilings, and massive glass windows. Thorne looked at Astrid's sprawling, low-profile, shallow-pitched barn and chuckled. "I heard the Norwegian widow was building a fortress of mud and sawdust," he said, adjusting his expensive wool coat. "Tell me, Mrs. Sorenson, did you run out of money for a proper roof pitch?" "A steep pitch catches the wind, Mr. Thorne," Astrid replied, not pausing in her work of hanging the heavy insulated barn doors. "A shallow pitch lets the wind pass over." "And what of the snow load?" Thorne demanded, pointing a gloved finger at the expansive roof spanning 40 by 50 feet. "When January drops 3 feet of wet heavy snow on that flat monstrosity, that span will snap like a dry twig. You'll be crushed beneath your own ignorance. My mansion has a 45-degree pitch. The snow slides right off. That is how you build for winter." "Your mansion is a sail," Astrid countered flatly. "And my roof will not snap. The load is distributed." She had designed the roof not as a mere cover, but as a unified truss system. The weight of the roof transferred down through central, load-bearing pillars of thick, raw timber, bypassing the cabin entirely and driving the force directly into the dry stone foundation. "The snow will actually insulate the barn further, Mr. Thorne. I welcome the weight." Thorne sneered at her poverty and her stubbornness. "We shall see who is warm in January, widow. Try not to freeze your stock when your roof caves in." Yet, Elias Thorne was wrong about the roof, and Silas Vance had been wrong about the miasma. But Astrid knew that Silas had been dangerously close to a different truth. The real danger wasn't just the cold. It was the moisture. Trapping 12,000 BTUs of animal heat also meant trapping gallons of water vapor exhaled by the livestock every single day. If that moisture built up, it would cause respiratory rot in the horses' lungs and pneumonia in the cows. To solve this, Astrid engineered 2 convective roof cupolas at the highest peaks of the barn. She utilized the stack effect not as a floor, but as a lung. She installed low, baffled intake vents near the floor. As the livestock heated the air, it expanded, became buoyant, and rose toward the ceiling, carrying the dangerous moisture and ammonia with it. This hot, wet air escaped through the slatted cupolas. As it fled the building, it created a gentle, unnoticeable vacuum that pulled fresh, dry, bitterly cold air in through the low floor vents. The animals immediately warmed this fresh air, and the cycle continued. The barn breathed. The dew point was managed perfectly. The timber remained bone dry. The final skeptic to arrive did not care about thermodynamics or load-bearing geometry. Reverend Josiah Miller, a stern man of 50 who viewed the frontier as a place of constant moral testing, drove his wagon into her yard on the 1st of November. The sky was already bruised purple with the threat of the coming winter. "Sister Sorenson," the Reverend intoned, his voice echoing with pulpit authority, "I must protest this arrangement. You intend to sleep mere feet from beasts of burden. You bring the filth of the field into the sanctity of the home." "The cabin is sealed, Reverend," Astrid said, sweeping the last of the sawdust from the floorboards. "I have my door. They have their stalls. We merely share the air between." "It is a descent into primitive savagery," Reverend Miller declared, his face flushing. The book of Leviticus demands separation. Man was given dominion over the beasts, not commanded to sleep among them like a pagan in a cave. You demean your late husband's memory by turning his home into a stable. Astrid finally stopped her work. She leaned against her heavy broadaxe and looked the Reverend dead in the eye. "The Lord gave me a mind to understand the cold, Reverend Miller," she said, her voice dropping to a solemn, authoritative quiet. "And he gave me the hands to build a defense against it. Frostbite does not care about your propriety. The wind does not read Leviticus. When the sky turns white, we will see if your pride keeps your congregation as warm as my savagery keeps me." The Reverend turned his wagon around without another word, leaving Astrid alone in the shadow of her massive, strange, perfectly engineered house barn. She sealed the heavy outer doors just as the first true flakes of snow began to fall. The skeptics had spoken. The conventional wisdom of the American West had condemned her to death by rot, collapse, or freezing. But inside the envelope of the barn, standing beside the warm, massive flank of her draft horse, Astrid listened to the wind begin to howl against the double-boarded walls. The trial had begun. The atmosphere above the Montana Territory did not merely shift on January 9, 1887, it collapsed. Meteorologists of the era, operating with primitive barometers and telegraph reports, could not fully map the catastrophic convergence taking place over the Continental Divide. A massive, sluggish, low-pressure system, saturated with Pacific moisture, had stalled over the Rockies. Simultaneously, an Arctic high-pressure ridge of unprecedented density was sliding south from the Canadian Shield. When these two atmospheric titans collided over the Gallatin Valley, they produced a meteorological event of such localized violence that it permanently altered the history of the American West. It was the genesis of what survivors would forever call the Great Die-Up. The morning of January 9th was deceptively, cruelly mild. At noon, the thermometer nailed to the outer wall of Astrid's barn read a balmy 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy and still, but the air held a strange, metallic taste. By 2:00 p.m., the barometric pressure plunged so rapidly that the livestock grew highly agitated. The draft horses stamped their heavy hooves against the packed earth floor, and the cows lowed nervously. Astrid, recognizing the deep ancestral warning in the animals' behavior, double-checked the heavy iron latches on the outer barn doors and ensured the convective cupolas were throttled down to their minimum aperture. At 4:15 p.m., the Arctic front hit the valley floor. It did not arrive as a gentle snowfall, but as a physical wall of blinding white violence. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in less than 3 hours. By dusk, it was 12 degrees below zero. The wind, screaming down from the mountain passes, reached sustained speeds of 55 miles per hour. It stripped the dead leaves from the cottonwoods, tore shingles from distant roofs, and drove granular, pulverized ice crystals horizontally across the prairie, with enough kinetic force to draw blood from exposed skin. By midnight, the ambient outside temperature had plummeted to a staggering 46 degrees below zero. Out on the open prairie, the conventional wisdom of the American frontier was failing, and it was failing with lethal consequences. The arrogant architecture of the skeptics, built to conquer the landscape rather than cooperate with it, was being systematically dismantled by physics. 3 miles to the east, Silas Vance, the sawmill owner who had mocked Astrid's sealed tomb, was fighting a losing battle inside one of his own pristine, balloon-framed houses. Balloon framing, a modern marvel of the era, utilized continuous vertical studs running from the sill plate to the roof plate. But without modern fire stops or insulation blocking those cavities, the hollow walls acted as massive, hidden chimneys. The 55-mile-per-hour winds hit the exterior cladding, forced freezing air through the microscopic gaps in the siding, and created violent freezing convection loops inside the walls themselves. Silas was feeding his cast-iron stove a continuous diet of split pine, burning through 40 pounds of wood an hour. Yet, the heat simply bled out through the uninsulated walls. The moisture from his own frantic exhaling breath condensed and froze instantly upon the interior wallpaper, creating a glittering, terrifying frost inside his own bedroom. His modern, airy design had become a thermodynamic hemorrhage. Further north, Elias Thorne's sprawling three-story Victorian mansion was proving that wealth could not bribe the wind. Thorne had built for aesthetics, prioritizing a complex, steep-pitched roof with 45-degree gables to shed snow, and installing massive, single-pane glass windows to showcase his prosperity. But a steep roof with complex valleys creates turbulent wind eddies, and single-pane glass possesses an R value of roughly 1.0, meaning it offers virtually zero resistance to heat transfer. The sub-zero wind stripped the thermal envelope of the mansion bare. Thorne's massive fireplaces were drafting backward. The extreme low pressure created by the gale-force winds outside literally sucked the smoke and heat down the chimneys and out through the drafty floorboards, filling his ornate parlor with choking, freezing soot. Worse still was the fate of Thorne's wealth. Out on the vast fenceless acreage, his thousands of cattle, which he had arrogantly left to forage on the open range, assuming they could weather a normal storm, were dying. Unable to penetrate the ice-crusted snow to reach the grass, and possessing absolutely no shelter from the -46-degree wind chill, the herd simply froze where they stood, transforming the prairie into a macabre, frozen graveyard. In the center of town, Reverend Josiah Miller was discovering that dogmatic rigidity offered poor insulation. He had insisted on keeping his firewood piled neatly against the distant property line, adhering to the strict visual order he demanded of his flock. When the storm hit, a massive 8-foot snowdrift formed between the parsonage back door and the woodshed. By the morning of January 10th, the Reverend was entirely cut off from his fuel supply. He and his family were burning the wooden pews from the church sanctuary just to keep the internal temperature of the parsonage marginally above freezing. But inside the windowless, sprawling expanse of Astrid Sorenson's house barn, a fundamentally different reality was taking place. Nature was unleashing its absolute worst against the outer walls of the structure, but the storm had to fight through layers of brilliant vernacular engineering. The 55-mile-per-hour wind hammered the outer pine boards, but it immediately hit the 4-inch cavity, packed densely with sawdust and agricultural lime. This massive thermal break arrested the cold. The 4 feet of cured prairie hay resting in the loft absorbed whatever frost attempted to penetrate the roof structure. Inside the barn's massive envelope, the biological furnace was operating flawlessly. The 3 draft horses, the 2 dairy cows, and the flock of poultry stood calmly in their stalls. They were chewing their cud, digesting their hay, and radiating a continuous, gentle 12,000 BTUs of sensible heat into the trapped air. Because Astrid had excavated below the frost line, the earth beneath the barn floor maintained a constant geothermal temperature of roughly 50 degrees, acting as a massive warm anchor against the freezing air above. At midnight on January 10th, while the outside temperature screamed at -46 degrees, the ambient air temperature inside the livestock aisles of Astrid's barn stabilized at a humid, earthy 42 degrees Fahrenheit. It smelled of sweet hay, warm manure, and animal breath, the scent of survival. And tucked dead center within this massive 42-degree thermal buffer sat Neil's original 12x14 log cabin. Because the cabin was no longer fighting the negative 46-degree atmosphere, but was instead merely resting inside a 42-degree protective bubble, the heating requirements for Astrid's living quarters dropped to near zero. Inside the cabin, Astrid sat comfortably in her rocking chair, knitting a wool stocking by the light of a kerosene lamp. The thermometer on her interior wall read a perfectly stable 64 degrees Fahrenheit. She was not engaged in a desperate, frantic battle to feed a roaring fire. Over the course of 24 hours, Astrid burned a total of exactly 15 pounds of seasoned lodgepole pine, perhaps 4 or 5 moderate splits of wood. The small stove merely sipped fuel, releasing a gentle, radiant warmth that easily maintained the room's temperature because the heat had nowhere to escape. The stack effect was neutralized. The freezing drafts were eliminated. The housebarn was an absolute triumph of physics over pride. The blizzard did not break on the second day. It intensified. For 72 continuous hours, the Gallatin Valley was subjected to a total whiteout. The horizon vanished. The sky and the earth fused into a singular howling vortex of lethal cold. By the afternoon of January 11th, the situation for the skeptics escalated from desperate to catastrophic. Elias Thorne's mansion had become an unlivable freezer. The internal temperature had dropped to 12 degrees. His hands were heavily frostbitten from attempting to clear a blocked chimney, and his survival instincts finally overrode his immense pride. Simultaneously, Reverend Miller and his wife, having burned the last splinter of the church's wooden furniture, wrapped themselves in every woolen blanket they owned and abandoned the parsonage. In a twist of blind, desperate fate, Thorne's fleeing carriage, pulled by two freezing, panicked horses, intersected with the Reverend's family on the main road. The snow was drifting to 5 feet in places. Visibility was less than 3 yards. To stop moving was to die. To guess the wrong direction was to die. The only geographic marker left in the blinding white chaos was the heavy, barbed wire property line fence that Thorne himself had ordered constructed the previous summer. A fence that ran directly west, culminating at the edge of the Norwegian widow's acreage. For 3 hours, the wealthiest man in the county and the most righteous man in the settlement dragged themselves and their terrified dependents along that fence line. They moved hand over hand along the freezing wire, their eyelashes freezing shut, their extremities losing all sensation. The wind screamed its indifference to their status, their bank accounts, and their theology. The brutal arithmetic of the frontier was foreclosing on them. By 7:30 p.m. on the third night of the storm, Thorne's gloved hand struck something solid in the dark. It was not a fence post. It was a massive, dry-stacked stone foundation. He looked up through the swirling, blinding snow and saw the towering wooden wall of Astrid's house barn. It stood immovable against the gale, an island of engineered resilience in an ocean of death. Thorne collapsed against the heavy timber doors, too weak to shout over the roar of the wind. He simply beat his frost-deadened fists against the thick pine boards, the Reverend collapsing to his knees in the snow beside him, dragging his weeping wife against his chest. They were minutes away from terminal hypothermia. Their bodies had ceased shivering, a dark biological sign that their core temperatures were crashing toward the point of no return. Inside the barn, Storm, Astrid's largest draft horse, suddenly shifted in his stall and let out a low, vibrating whinny, turning his massive head toward the primary entrance. Astrid, who had been brushing the horse's coat in the 42-degree ambient warmth of the barn aisle, paused. She set the brush down, picked up her heavy iron lantern, and walked to the heavy double doors. She unthrew the thick iron crossbeam and pulled the door inward. The storm violently breached the gap, a howling swirl of white powder and minus 40-degree air that instantly crystallized the moisture on Astrid's face. But there, tumbling through the threshold and spilling onto the sawdust-packed floor, were the men who had mocked her. Elias Thorne, his expensive wool coat stiff with ice, stared up at her from the floor. Reverend Miller, his face a mask of frostbite and terror, scrambled inside, dragging his wife away from the wind. Astrid did not gloat. She did not ask questions. She simply threw her weight against the heavy timber door, sealing the storm back outside where it belonged. As the heavy iron latch fell perfectly into place, the screaming roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of a dairy cow chewing her cud and the profound, life-saving stillness of trapped, biological warmth. The catastrophic blizzard of 1887, the storm that initiated the legendary Great Die-Up, raged without a single moment of reprieve until the pre-dawn hours of January 12th. When the Arctic wind finally exhausted its fury, the silence that fell over the Gallatin Valley was absolute, heavy, and profound. It was the terrifying stillness of a world that had been violently erased and painted a blinding, featureless white. Inside the envelope of the housebarn, the biological furnace had never faltered. The ambient temperature in the livestock aisles had held at a stable 41 degrees Fahrenheit for 72 hours. Inside the central log cabin, buffered by the dead air, the sawdust-packed walls, and the continuous 12,000 BTUs of radiant animal heat, the thermometer read a comfortable 62 degrees. Astrid Sorenson had burned a total of exactly 45 pounds of lodgepole pine over 3 days. At dawn, Astrid unlatched the heavy timber doors. The snow had drifted 12 feet high against the northern wall, but the shallow, reinforced pitch of her roof had performed flawlessly, shedding the bulk of the load just as she had calculated. The structural pillars, transferring the weight directly into the dry stone foundation below the frost line, hadn't even groaned. Elias Thorne, the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory, sat on a rough-hewn pine chair inside Astrid's tiny cabin. He was holding a tin cup of black coffee, his heavily frost-damaged hands wrapped in wool batting. Beside him, Reverend Josiah Miller sat in stunned, silent exhaustion, his theology thoroughly dismantled by the brute reality of the Montana winter. They were listening to the rhythmic, peaceful sound of Astrid's dairy cow chewing her cud in the adjacent stall. "I have lost everything," Thorne whispered, his voice entirely stripped of its former arrogance. He stared blankly through the open cabin door into the barn aisle. He knew, with the grim certainty of a man who understood the prairie, that out on the fenceless expanse of his empire, his thousands of cattle were frozen solid. His Victorian mansion, with its steep gables and single-pane glass, was a magnificent, uninhabitable icebox. His immense capital had proven utterly worthless against the physics of the atmosphere. Reverend Miller, who had declared the house barn a descent into pagan savagery, bowed his head over his coffee. "We are alive, Elias," the clergyman said softly. "We are alive because we were sheltered by the very beasts we were commanded to separate from." He looked up at Astrid, who was calmly measuring out a scoop of oats for her draft horse. "You were right, Mrs. Sorenson. The wind does not read the scriptures." 2 days later, on January 14th, Silas Vance rode his half-starved gelding up the property line. The sawmill owner had barely survived his own balloon-frame nightmare by feeding his glowing cast-iron stove every 20 minutes for 3 unbroken days, burning through half his winter reserve of wood. He had ridden out expecting to find Astrid entombed beneath a collapsed, rotting roof, and Thorne and the Reverend frozen somewhere along the fence line. Instead, Silas found the Reverend standing inside the massive 40-degree barn aisle in his shirt sleeves, comfortably brushing the coat of a draft horse. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen snow, and walked slowly into the house barn. He took off his hat. He felt the warm, earthy air wash over his freezing face. He looked at the perfectly dry timber of the interior walls. There was no condensation. There was no rot. There was no suffocating miasma of disease. The convective roof cupolas were pulling the moisture out of the building with silent, invisible efficiency, maintaining a perfect dew point. Silas Vance, the man who prided himself on modernity and conventional building, reached into his heavy coat, pulled out a measuring tape and a leather-bound notebook, and began writing. "How wide is the air cavity?" Silas asked, his voice cracking with the humbling realization that everything he thought he knew about frontier construction was wrong. 4 inches, Astrid replied from the cabin doorway, packed dense with sawdust and lime. "And the roof vents? You calculated the draft based on the volume of the animals?" "Based on the heat they give off, Mr. Vance," she corrected gently. "They are the furnace. The vents are simply the chimney." That morning marked a permanent shift in the vernacular architecture of the Gallatin Valley. The Great Die-Up would claim the lives of dozens of settlers and hundreds of thousands of livestock across the territory. It bankrupted Elias Thorne entirely, forcing him to return east, a broken man. But the survivors who remained had learned a profound, inescapable lesson. Over the next 5 years, variations of the Sorenson housebarn began appearing across the Montana and Dakota territories. Builders stopped fighting the environment with brute force and massive fires and started utilizing thermal mass, biological heat trapping, and integrated shelter systems. Today, modern architectural engineers studying the extreme energy efficiency standard known as passive house, utilize the exact principles Astrid Sorenson executed in 1886 out of sheer desperate necessity. Modern sustainable homes rely on hyper-insulated airtight envelopes to prevent the stack effect. They utilize heat recovery ventilation, HRV systems, the high-tech equivalent of Astrid's carefully baffled floor vents and roof cupolas, to exhaust stale, wet air while retaining the sensible heat. They understand that a home should not be a leaky wooden box battling the winter, but a sealed thermal battery that requires almost zero external energy to remain comfortable. Astrid did not have fiberglass insulation, synthetic vapor barriers, or mechanical HRV units. She had sawdust, prairie grass, dry stacked stone, and the biological BTUs of her livestock. And with those scavenged materials, she achieved a thermodynamic triumph that modern builders still struggle to replicate. Astrid Sorenson never remarried. She did not need to. In the spring of 1887, while the rest of the territory was reeling from catastrophic losses, Astrid's livestock emerged from the house barn, healthy, rested, and ready to work. She leveraged her surviving draft horses to plow fields for desperate neighbors, demanding payment in small parcels of foreclosed land. By the turn of the century, the penniless Norwegian widow, who had been mocked by cowboys and lectured by wealthy men, owned over 800 acres of prime Montana real estate. She died in her sleep in the winter of 1922 at the age of 70. Her obituary in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle called her a matriarch of the valley, a woman of immense practical wisdom who had taught an entire generation of settlers how to endure the impossible. It mentioned her vast landholdings and her generous donations to the local school board. But it did not mention the 40 by 50-foot house barn that had started it all. That structure, however, outlived her. It stood intact until the late 1950s, its massive, dry-stacked stone foundation never shifting, its sawdust-packed walls never rotting. It remained as silent, physical proof of a fundamental frontier truth. The American West was not conquered by the loudest men, the steepest roofs, or the deepest pockets. It was survived by those who had the humility to observe the land, the intelligence to adapt to its violence, and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom when their lives depended on it. The men who mocked Astrid Sorenson nearly froze to death under the weight of their own arrogance. She survived because she understood that nature does not care about your pride, your wealth, or your theology. When the temperature drops to 40 below zero, physics is the only judge that matters. If you found value in this story, if you believe that the ingenious solutions of the past still hold vital lessons for our future, hit that like button to help others find these stories of creativity. Subscribe to preserve this knowledge